Okay. Okay, well, we have a full house. Welcome to the first plenary of this year's core, and welcome our speaker, Donna Haraway. I'll let Nada introduce her, but I'll just say two things. So one thing is that she trained as a biologist. So she developed a career in philosophy and feminist studies, but she actually trained originally as a biologist. And she's had an impact in several fields of biology. So this shows that the higher your level of thinking, the more cross-disciplinary it is, essentially. And the other thing I wanted to say is that she trained in a small liberal arts college, which kind of resonates with what the colleges are about here at UCSC. So there's that connection as well. So the format that we're doing for the plenaries is completely new. They used to be done in large lecture halls, but we're going to try to do this smaller format to see if it works better. It fosters a connection with the speaker. And also it brings students who are really interested in the topic. We're recording this, so everybody will be able to see it. And some of the sections are also on Zoom, so they'll be able to ask questions as well. Okay, thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Manel. Thank you, Donna. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight, all the faculty. This is such an honor and privilege for me. I can't tell you how tickled I am. But first, let me tell you a little bit about Donna. Donna is an amazing scholar. She taught here at UCSC for many years. She was the chair in the History of Consciousness Department and Feminist Studies Department here. As Manel said, she first started her studies with biology, and then, I don't know what happened first, but in 1984, she wrote a little ditty called the Cyborg Manifesto, and really skyrocketed. And since then, she is an emerita here at UCSC, and most recently, in July, she was elected to Fellowship of the British Academy. And so she is world-renowned, and she has some very interesting little quirks. I don't know, but she loves science fiction, and so it'll be interesting to see if we can get her to talk a little bit about her love of science fiction.
It's easy, hint.
And so we're going to be talking about an article that Donna wrote. Was it 2012? That's okay.
About.
It's called A Wash in Urine. And Donna was able to write an article like this because of her stature. And the article really illuminates Frankenstein, or maybe can have Frankenstein as a jumping off point. And there's many different themes in both Frankenstein and in A Wash in Urine. And many of them, I think, have to do with what it is to be human, what it is to have trans species, trans cyborg type relationships. And so I'd like to start with well, first of all, what's a cyborg? Oh, you got that.
Well, first of all, has everybody in this room read Frankenstein? Is that part of your core course this term? Excellent. So we have that in common. And I think that Cyborg and Frankenstein do have a kind of kin relationship, not a kind of a direct genealogical descent, but a kind of complex queer cousin relationship that turns on several things. And what came to me first when Nada asked, we talked about this a little bit last Friday, when Nada and I first talked about it, was that my cyborg and Frankenstein's monster are both they are both a disobedience to their origins. They both understand the failure of their fathers, and their fathers, in their own hubris, are unable responsibly to recognize their progeny in such a way that the progeny undo and redo the world in both promising and monstrous ways. And cyborgs have a very distinctive origin point in 20th century, mid-20th century history. They emerge at the intersection of military technology, of systems research, of the beginning of seriously powerful digital operations infiltrating almost every domain of life, the importance of military funding, and also of large corporate communications funding, the Bell Telephone Laboratories and so on, absolutely fundamental to the emergence of cyborgs as real entities and actors in the world. So they're both ideas, but they're also, as solid as this single-use plastic and similarly toxic. And indeed, rather linked. But for me, I was particularly interested in cyborgs in the early 1980s. The term had been coined in the 1960s in relationship to the man in space projects of NASA and the efforts to develop organisms called man that could handle the challenges of homeostasis in extreme environments, how to maintain blood sugar, salt balance, temperature, the body under Earth conditions and many, if not most, Earth conditions. Organic bodies are able to maintain stable parameters within rather interesting limits, and the limits can be fairly flexible, but put organisms in extreme environments for which they were not evolved, and rapidly they break down. So a kind of systems approach to system breakdown in the Man in Space program begins to invent cyborgs, beginning with laboratory rodents that were implanted with telemetric brain implants or with little dialysis bags that would alter salt or sugar balance. The first actually existing mammalian cyborgs were laboratory rats that were surrogates for Man in Space in the Man in Space program. So the word does not mean robot. Okay? It doesn't mean machine. It means a particular confluence of systems thinking applied to biology as well as to technology. It's a particular historical moment from the mid-20th century on. Cyborgs, in a really serious way, did not pre-exist the World War II and post-World War II intersections. And they transform life for everybody, but not in the same ways. As a feminist in the early 1980s, I was the delegate of the Socialist Review to a meeting in then Yugoslavia, in this gorgeous resort on the beautiful coast of Yugoslavia. There was a meeting of kind of radical left thinkers from European, Asian, African, and North American countries. And I was selected as the delegate of the Socialist Review from Berkeley. And I was going to talk about reproductive unfreedom and problems of reproductive technology in relation to the oppression of women. It's not a topic that's gone away. It was a topic very dear to my heart. But I and other people got there and became acutely aware of the women running the Xerox machines, serving us water, serving us food, taking care of the men in suits. There were lots of men in suits, especially from North Korea and Eastern European and the Soviet bloc countries. It was my first serious, community of men in suits. And then a fair number of the radical leftists of the 1960s, 70s, 80s also there. We banded together in a kind of making the labor of the people who made the conference possible visible moment, and started giving talks with and started taking a kind of labor action at the conference as an instantiation of Marxist feminist politics. It was out of that experience that I wrote the Cyborg Manifesto, interestingly enough. It was an argument that the biological organism, the systems, digital, technological entities, and human beings had intersected in an earth-changing way called the cyborg. Okay? And that it need not be faithful to its origins. Like Frankenstein, the cyborg need not be faithful to its origins. So I've been interested from then on in a litter of non-heteronormative, non-genealogically reproductive, in cyborgs that don't do the civilizational work of creating yet once again the sacred image of the same. And it's monotheistic and monomaniacal, single-eyed apparatuses of oppression. Okay? So I use all sorts of instruments to do that. Some of them come from philosophy, some of them come from literature, some of them come from fables, which is part of literature, some of them come from biology, politics, so on. I use every imaginable tool to try to propose what my friend Anna Tsing calls the arts of flourishing on a damaged planet, to try to propose ways of making worlds with each other that might just have a chance for flourishing in the midst of on a damaged planet, that might have some chance of restorative and restitutive, of rehabilitative flourishing, without becoming anti-technological, without becoming anti-anything, but a kind of becoming with each other otherwise. And Awash and Urine is another chapter in what became a kind of life project.
That segues really well into the next big manifesto that I know of. Maybe you have more, but the Companion Species Manifesto. Right. Would you mind explaining a little bit, because that's kind of the background, because you begin with this relationship with Cayenne.
Right. Well, this is a paper clearly provoked by a couple of aging mammals who have, rather flaccid sphincter problems. And are trying to figure out which molecules will allow them to inhabit the same nighttime spaces. Anyway, you undoubtedly got all of the jokes. They're not particularly sophisticated. Cayenne, dog of my heart, sports partner for well over a decade. We ran and did pretty well, it must be said, in a fairly competitive, fairly fast sport together. Cayenne and I are both aging. Cayenne is an Australian shepherd, purpose-bred, purebred dog, in short, not innocent. The offspring of dogs that had been used to herd the sheep and the cattle of the Anglo-Con conquest west, of the post-Civil War conquest of the Rocky Mountain and coastal west. A dog who herded the sheep imported from Australia to feed the disappointed gold miners from the gold rush on. In other words, a dog of the ranching West, which is a white colonial story that in a significant way both Cayenne and I are white, not so much because of our color on some kind of spectrum as our positioning in civilizational projects, in projects of settlement. That required the removal of pre-existing orders and pre-existing peoples and substitution of eventually the agro-industrial complex that is California. That Cayenne is a dog who inherits this history in her flesh. She's from the kind of dogs who did the herding in the early ranching in California. Okay? She was a fast, amazing. Do you guys know Australian Shepherds? Okay. Australian Shepherds have been kind of ruined by the show dog culture. They got thicker chests, thicker necks, blockier heads. They aren't as agile. They aren't as fast. They aren't as lithe and athletic. The old-style Australian Shepherds could turn on a dime and were as fast as border collies, but considerably more sane. Okay. Point being, Cayenne was the dog of my heart. And I sat down and wrote the Companion Species Manifesto in 2003, which looked at evolutionary history of dogs. It looked at the history of dogs in sport and show. It looked at the history of dogs in colonial projects. I didn't take up the mastiffs in terms of the Spanish use of mastiffs in the genocides of the Caribbean, a subject that my colleague Carla Ficero has written about, but I did take up some of the colonial aspects of the ranching dogs. I was interested in the rescue dog scene, both local and international. I was interested in practices of love, the pet food trade, the industrial pet food and pet paraphernalia apparatus. I was interested in training discourses, which kind of track the ones for children. If you're looking at child development discourse and dog training discourses, they track very closely, including the tone of voice used to correct. Oh, what a good dog. Oh, what a good kid. I mean, if you, literally, even as to intonation, the dog training literatures and the early childhood education literatures track each other, which would be funny, except it kind of isn't. And in the Companion Species Manifesto, like in all of my work, there's a principle operating. I try not to be cheap in the sense that I will not engage in critique of something I don't love. In other words, it's easy to critique something you hate. In fact, it's easy to do nothing but critique. But how do you engage in that kind of implicated, loving, resisting, redoing, inhabiting? How do you engage in a kind of deep critical thinking from within, from what you love, towards something that maybe deserves a future? Okay? How do you think from love, which doesn't preclude anger or rage or many other things? But for me, the Companion Species Manifesto grew out of my love affair with this little dog, which you see in a different stage of our lives together in the Awash and Urine paper.
There's a line in your article that says, the generative act of becoming with, that describes your relationship with Cayenne. And what is it and how did it happen?
Well, I have no idea how it happened.
It's like falling in love,
Well,
right?
and we always fall in love with inappropriate love objects. Freud was particularly clear about that. You're never in love with the right thing or the right person. Frankly, it's not fundamentally. Desire is not a question of choice or really intentionality, but it's being in the grip of, being blindsided by, finding yourself in each other's presence in a way that demands a response. There are things that make these things more likely than other things. For example, the way puppy breath smells makes it almost impossible not to fall in love immediately with any puppy in your hands. Human babies smell almost, but not quite as good. But they're using the same pheromonal strategies of really capturing the adults through smell. It's a bioevolutionary heritage of great strength. Anyway, there are all kinds of ways in which we are predisposed to fall in love with partners in both appropriate and inappropriate ways. I don't know how. I do know that I wanted to play, my husband and I had, quote, rescued, close quote, right out of the settlement house movement, the language of rescue. It's creepy. In any case, my husband and I had rescued a dog who was fighting with another dog and was going to have to be killed if he didn't stop it. So we took him in and re-socialized him. And the way we re-socialized him was by starting from, he was a 2-year-old, starting from the very beginning in teaching him peaceful reactions to all kinds of social situations and damping down his fear levels and building up his confidence levels and making him more and more competent in the world. And one of the things that we did with him, and that I did with him in particular, was play the sport together, play agility together, mainly as a way of building his confidence in the world. And I fell in love with the sport So thus, I started asking around in the sport dog scene who was breeding really high-drive sports dogs who might be willing to sell a puppy to me, because I wanted to really play this sport at as high a level as I was capable.
So I guess.
By the way, Nada and I every Friday do Pilates together. She's good.
She's better. The question is, how did Cayenne, I think, perform this generative act of becoming with?
How did she perform it?
We talked about it in class, about what you meant with this clause. And it's not empathy, it's more of coming together, those are the words you're using, of becoming with, of perhaps even understanding one another. Is that?
Certainly, in some ways, I think we did. It is conventional to talk about a human person or a dog or a living being becoming, unrolling into its achieved state, into its mature form, a kind of becoming. And that there would be an organism and an environment, and the organism would interact with its environment in such a way as to allow its unrolling of its genetic and biobehavioral program, and it would become itself. It's a kind of predisposition in our thought patterns toward individualism, toward thinking of the individual plus the environment. And the history of biology is as full of this as politics or other ways of thinking in our heritage. And I, and really many others, have made every effort to interrupt this and say there is only becoming with. And that the smallest unit of analysis is not the entity itself, an organism, for example, a fertilized cell, whatever, but a relationship. The smallest unit of analysis is relating. And that in the relatings, there are certain it's like precipitating out of solution. In relating, certain things become solid, certain things become stable, and go on for serious lengths of time, so that relatings have consequences, but everything is always becoming with. And furthermore, there is no absolute starting point, so that various kinds of paths are inherited in these relatings. So that in becoming with, which is never, it's a kind of a multidimensional as well as multitemporal matter, and the metaphor that I've used to talk about this is tentacular. Okay, the kind of tentacularity of becoming with. So that if you're talking about becoming with Cayenne into this entity that is still still changing, an entity that maybe inhabits this paper, this two that is neither two nor one. There was I was actually going somewhere with that was different from that.
Conjunctivitis.
Yeah, well, conjunctivitis, yes. The conjugations, the ways of becoming with. I know what I was going to say. That if you think about a dog and a person, a dog and a woman, a puppy and a middle-aged woman meet each other, and then follows a life together that goes on for about 17 years, because Cayenne died when she was 17 years old. Okay. Though I think of her now actually as an ancestor. She has a presence. I'm not I don't have any particular need to pronounce on the, what kind of presence this is. I'm perfectly willing to say it's not that kind of presence. Anyway, she's a kind of ancestor who lives as long as I do, as long as we do. But the ways we became with each other through those 17 years were touch, smell, kinetic motion together, emotionality, happiness, anger. There were times when we were running on the agility field together when I felt like we were attached by a bungee cord. And there was a kind of a strong, elastic something between us that was producing a kind of joy for each of us, a kind of high aliveness. There were other times when we shut each other down, or when I shut her down with my demands for performance, or with my authoritarian self, or she, I became tuned to the ways that she deflected my attention, deflected pressure, handled stress, and made space for herself outside of my demands in a way that called me to be really careful of the pressure of my own personality. I also became aware of the ways that interactions with each other required a kind of truth-telling that is, on the whole, not required for human language users. Human language users actually depend on the way language can never say what it means. And if it says what it means, you're lying in a kind of violent way. That language is really, really dependent on figures and tropes and obliqueness, and there are many names for these tropes, like irony, for example. There are ways in which people who study language have tried to name all of the ways that communicating with human language depends on, certainly it depends on truth-telling, but it's a kind of truth-telling that allows a lot of room for satire, for ridicule, for irony, for all kinds of things without doing damage. And in fact, if you're teaching a class and you want to keep people from becoming true believers, including yourself, you're lecturing about something you really think is the case, and you're very serious about it. You're lining up the evidence and you're telling the stories, and at the same time you're undermining it a little bit as you go, on purpose, in order to prevent a kind of true believer reaction. Not so as to undermine serious claims about the world, quite the opposite, so as to allow them by leaving open investigation, by all investigation ending in an opening, an ongoing curiosity. In other words, you cultivate the ability to be wrong if you're a halfway decent teacher. Okay? And it depends on certain uses of language. Do that with a dog in training, and your dog will shut down in a nanosecond. Okay? That I find that relationship with a dog is meaning making. You're engaged in communication. It's a kind of language, but different from the kind we use with each other in all sorts of ways, similar in other ways. But the necessity to tell the truth with Cayenne, not to joke when instead I needed to be clear. Not to dodge a conclusion. If you read this paper carefully, you'll watch that by the time I reach a period, I've dodged a lot of conclusions. There's a lot of dodging that goes on in order to keep things from freezing too soon. You can't do that in dog training. And she can't do that with me. There's a kind of truth-telling in becoming good at doing something with a being of another species. This is, I think, also true for children. That there's a way in which it's a gentler kind of meaning making. I think ordinary human language has a higher level of violence in its ways of getting at truth than are possible in good dog training, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it's great. You've long argued that being in a relationship with a pet makes you a bigger person. Could that continue with what you were saying?
Well, a lot of people tend to think that, there are famous philosophical passages in Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, for example, who are thought of as the great philosophers of becoming, and in many ways they are. But there's a passage in their section called Becoming Animal, in which they explicitly disparage fat old ladies and their dogs on Parisian streets. There's a kind of ridicule of women, especially older women, of animals, especially pets. They are beyond the pale. They are not at the center of reasonable attention. They are not important. They are the kind of trash of emotional life that's the respectable philosopher who really is thinking about becoming is rather more interested in the heroic story of the wolf, or what have you. I'm being slightly reductive. But it has been both my experience and it is my philosophical commitment that ordinary relationships are important, and that it's out of ordinary life that we will have half a chance to flourish on a damaged planet. It's out of learning how to repair and restore the ordinary to serious loving attention. And that being in a relationship of love with a child, with a lover, with a dog, with a tree, with a molecule, being in a relationship of caring, loving, responsive curiosity is the ordinary stuff of building a good life. And if you take it seriously, okay, here we are. Who are we? Is the question. Literally, here we are. God knows how we ended up in the same room together. But if we take it seriously and we say, okay, then what? Who are we? And how do we track the threads that make this encounter possible, that perhaps set up the possibility of consequences, that tell us something about what are the multiple histories, evolutionary, chemical, political, cultural, what are the multiple threads that come together in this becoming with? So that if you take a woman and her dog seriously, for example, in a wash and urine, and they're both taking various forms of disreputable estrogens to deal with their aging, and you unwind the threads of those molecules, you end up in the history of the pharmaceutical industry, you end up on the horse farms in Manitoba, you end up with the women's health movement in the around DES, you end up in the history of gynecology, you end up with German research in the 1930s in German zoos. You don't go everywhere. In other words, you track real threads. You aren't making stuff up, but you're tracking threads. And these threads collectively tangle a world that situates this woman and this dog, that situate these beings who are becoming these beings who are becoming with each other in worlds that ramify, that reach out to other worlds. And I feel like it's important to know more at the end of the day than you knew in the morning, and that once you know, you can't unknow. Once I know about the apparatus for collecting urine from pregnant horses in order to make Premarin, once I know, I can't not know. I can deny, I can evade, I can say I don't have time for that, I'm just not going to be responsible, but that becomes a moral and a political choice. At that point, and you can say, I really can't pay attention to that right now. I'm really, trying to get an education and paying attention to the complete immigration fiasco in the state of California. I don't have time for everything. Perfectly reasonable answer. But what's not okay is not to know, okay, once you know. And what's not okay is not leaving open the possibility of threads of alliance. Everybody doesn't have to do the same thing, heaven knows, but we can connect with each other. We can make attachment sites. We can leave open the possibility of connecting. And that's really what I mean by taking ordinary life seriously. It's through the very fleshly, ordinary, real of ordinary life and its ramifications both into past and laterally in space and into possible futures, and learning to connect with each other, to undo worlds that are deadly and to redo, both to inherit and to invent worlds that make more sense. So that's what I think scholarship's about, basically.
Well, I was going to ask you about valuing the mundane, but that's exactly what you just explained. Would you say that this story was grounded in the mundane?
Yes. I have a lot of axes to grind in this paper. You will have noticed. Among them, I'm particularly interested in making kin non-biogenetically. It's not like I don't think it's okay to have babies, as long as we have fewer of them. It's that I'm really, really interested in figuring out how to make kin really exuberantly and creatively and strongly, because I feel like never have we been in a time in human history, pretty well all over the world, where the importance of learning to make enduring non-biological family with each other has been more urgent. Think of the problem of homelessness in this world, the problem of the displacement of families, populations, individuals, whole worlds violently displaced from any possibility of home. And this is a multi-species issue. Think of the homelessness caused by climate change for the insects, for the flowers, for the marine creatures. Think of the radical displacements from home, and then start thinking about what it takes to make kin in the face of the ferocity of homelessness. Think of the desperate immigrations. Pretty well all over the earth right now, and people being met with fierce xenophobia and fierce racism and fierce fear by those whose own homes are not very stable either, who are themselves often operating out of fear and excluding the fearful other. Think of the way that's going on in such a widespread way. So every chance I get to talk about making kin, I take.
Yes. We need to make kin with all trans species. Let's see. I was going to ask you about how do you do your process in writing something such as a wash?
A wash in urine. Well, I think this one really did. I think I say it in the early part of the paper. This one really did come from going to the vet with Cayenne and Karen Hoban prescribing DES because her blood pressure was higher than it should have been because she had some early heart disease. She was 12 years old. It was not a time to let her blood pressure go up. She had already had some urinary leakage issues, which are very common in females. Anybody who has cats is probably especially aware of it. Although the males tend to be even more problematic in this regard than the females. Anyway, not an unusual problem. Veterinarians and human doctors deal with it all the time. And to be prescribed DES, I really did have post-traumatic DES syndrome because it was that molecule, diethylstilbestrol, was one of the flashpoints of the feminist women's health movements that shaped me as a person in the world, because it was prescribed to pregnant women to prevent miscarriage for decades after the evidence was in that it didn't do any good, and the evidence was growing that it caused all kinds of cancers and reproductive difficulties on into the second generation and then the third generation. That DES was an extraordinarily potent molecule that became widespread. I think I give the figure of several million people and women in the United States had been prescribed DES before this scandal was over. And the scandal around DES was one of the flashpoints of the feminist women's health movement. And so when all of a sudden my dog is prescribed DES, I was also laughing, of course, like, oh my God, is this really happening? And whenever I get anxious, I don't know about you, but the way I handle anxiety is kind of by obsessive research. I used to head for the library. Now I confess that I head for the screen, which is a kind of library. It's very powerful, but it's also not as powerful in other ways as, McHenry and the Science Library actually going in the stacks. There's something about a physical library which is really, really important. But in any case, I handle anxiety by trying to know more. It's a straight-up obsession. It's a kind of psychopathology. I go for obsessive knowledge in the face of anxiety. So here I was anxious about DES, and I went for obsessive knowledge about the history of the molecule, and tracking it again otherwise, and tracking it in relation to Premarin. And hormone replacement therapy and all the rest of it that was simultaneously has been controversial from the get-go and remains controversial in human medicine. So it was a pretty simple origin. It was the vet's office.
So grounded in this mundane story of a dog having urine spots, you go from feedlots, slaughterhouses, agricultural, human, ecological well-being, advocacy, obligations, and almost around the world.
But hopefully, I try, sometimes fail as a writer and a thinker, but I try not to just leap, but track threads. Track the evidence, if you will. I think of myself as a kind of forensic investigator, almost. So I end up in those German zoos by tracking the history of endocrinology, the history of hormone biochemistry, and the actual physical apparatus of the early research. So I track the early endocrinologist biochemists into the slaughterhouses as they are literally collecting buckets of pituitary glands from slaughtered pigs in order to take it back to the lab to extract and purify a few micrograms, of a hormone that will be used in investigation. The physical history of the laboratory is very interesting. And watching the evolution of laboratory, you walk into a lab now, if you go up on Science Hill and you go into a lab, most labs kind of look alike and they all look like they're full of screens. They are all full of screens, though you can find other equipment if you look. It used to be easier to feel the physical difference of laboratories because the material of laboratory investigation was more prominent in the space of laboratory research. And I think those periods of the history of science are very interesting. I think the evolution of the apparatus of knowledge making that's a topic that interests me as among the fields that I've trained in our history of science and science studies. So I tracked those threads with both Premarin and DES.
One of the big sentences that you have in this story is at the very end of your talking about DES, and you talk about this molecular generation that's integral to the ecosystem destroying, human and animal labor transforming, multi-species soul mutilating, epidemic friendly, corn monocrop promoting, cross-species heartbreaking feedlot cattle industries. And I was telling my classes, I thought this is like the encapsulation of a hurt world.
Can I have that?
Yeah.
I want to read that sentence out loud too.
That's a great sentence.
Point it to me.
It's underlined. That's where it begins there.
Okay, but the core story here is not DES as such. The big story is the relentless rise of hormonal growth promoters of the next molecular generations that are integral to the ecosystem destroying, human and animal labor transforming, multi-species soul mutilating, epidemic friendly, corn monocrop promoting, cross-species heartbreaking feedlot cattle industries. It's all about the feedlot cattle industry. So drive down Highway 99, and watch the cattle in feedlots. And the epidemic-friendly relationship to microbiology. We're in the University of California system here, UC Santa Cruz, which means we're very closely related to UC Davis and the other UC campuses. Very big part of the history of agribusiness is at UC Davis, including the really important research for food efficiency conversion, research, both animal breeding as well as feed formulation and husbandry methodologies. You know that the cattle in the feedlot are maintained just this side of physiological collapse because they're not really evolved to digest corn. They're maintained just this side of physiological collapse that is consistent with maximum weight gain up to the ideal age of slaughter. So it's a way of taking an animal, a cow in this case, and integrating its biobehavioral and bioevolutionary apparatus into a profit extraction system of maximizing its productivity so as to extract value and to extract maximum value just before system breakdown. Okay? The cruelty is not accidental, is what I'm saying. It's rational. It's extremely rational. And I'm very interested in that particular history of rationality. That is about maximizing productivity for value extraction. Call it capitalism. Pretty good shorthand word.
We could talk a little bit more about misogyny, what it means to be a man, how much of this has to do with conquest and self-justification that got you to write that sentence and make that sentence actually, in a way, describe a truth that's happening.
Mm-hmm. Well, what gets me to write that sentence is that kind of misogyny that I define as despising the fleshly body, which certainly includes men too, that despising the body, which becomes simply a means to the abstract. Money, power, military conquest, the living, dying world is the raw material for transformation into the means of extracting value, into extracting value in various forms. Power and money are the most obvious, but not the only ones. And the disparagement of the animal and plant bodies and the disparagement of female bodies is particularly prominent. A kind of violent anger toward the organic body, I think, is built into these kinds of destructive practices. Freud would have called it thanatos, a death urge. And the affirmation of ordinary living and dying. I am not a pro-life writer. I refuse to talk about just living because I think it is a deadly abstraction. I'm interested in mortality, which is one of the reasons I write about aging. By the way, I'm 3/4 of a century old as of last week. Kind of, woohoo! I'm interested in mortality. If anyone says living, I say and dying. And living and dying well with each other is what I'm interested in. And I think misogyny is rooted in the lust for transcendence, the lust for escape from the female body, the lust of the escape from the generativity of bodies. And men get swept up into that too, obviously. Among other ways, they have been, well, the military machine is perhaps the best example of the ways men are swept up into the machines of death with what? Through coercion, but also through certain kinds of promises. It's not accidental that armed men are sources of excess violence and need to be trained to a kind of control. Good militaries are very well trained and have their violence under tight control. But that kind of unleashing of male violence, I think, is a kind of misogyny.
And how would you then connect that to Big Pharma and the damage that they have done to these bodies in the name of profit?
Even as I take my Crestor and my Zetia and, make sure my friend is getting her diabetes medication and, really promoting vaccinations, and anybody who's anti-vaccine is not my friend. And I talk about Big Pharma. This is what I meant by language earlier. I will talk about Big Pharma. I'll talk about the opioid outrage. I'll talk about the surplus profits. I'll talk about the way drug development makes it really hard to develop the drugs that humans and other organisms actually need, and really easy to develop the drugs that are going to be have high profit margins. I'm very willing to talk about the pricing systems that allow gouging and allow, a tiny modification in a device for insulin delivery to increase its price by 800 times? Wasn't that the figure in the recent scandals? I'm completely willing, in fact, eager, to talk about the scandals. They aren't scandals, actually. They're systemic performance features. They're features, not scandals, these apparatuses. But I refuse to become anti-pharmaceutical in the process of telling these stories. I'm also very interested in the love and skill that go into making a molecule that works. I'm very interested in the collegiality that makes it possible for people to share knowledge in working laboratories. I am as interested in making visible the apparatuses of knowledge making that I want to affirm, most certainly including in the making of pharmaceuticals. So it's easy to do nothing but critique and much harder to hold the contradictions together, I think.
Which kind of goes back to the word pharmacon, which you reference in this chapter, right, which is both poison and cure.
Exactly.
If as a concept of poison and cure, I guess Derrida talked about writing as the pharmacon, and Plato and others have talked about writing as a kind of a mnemonic for memory. So it kind of kills memory, even as it allows us to do other things. So do pharmaceuticals. So we're kind of yoking ourselves to these necessary poisons, like we yoke ourselves to the people who are both hurting and harming us. That's sort of the history of colonial conquest, right? Why women have to yoke themselves to men historically, or why, as Ansel.
Sometimes it's great fun, yeah.
Historically, but I'm curious whether or not those empowered can conceive of this kinship that you're talking about and kind of counter yoke. Can people empowered make kinship with people that they don't, which they have historically seen as really being there to extract value from for their purpose? I mean, does this climate crisis make people make kin with the little laborers who are enabling them to be powerful and so forth?
That's really crucial, but I think that lots of people in powerful positions are doing their damnedest to ally across the spectrum, including across class and privilege, to find creative solutions to urgent problems. I think that we are embedded in serious structural systems that make it very difficult and even punish people in all locations in the structure who really try to build other structures from the inside out. But I don't think the cure, straight out of Plato, I don't think the pharmacon, the cure that is also the curare, the cure that is also the poison, I think that's true not just when you get into toxic environments, but I think that this is true in general. That the milk you drink is also the poison you drink. Okay? And I think part of the job of good scholarship is not to become a skeptic, a cynic, or a relativist, and let the knowledge that everything is full of its own contradictions, that everything is always already at least double and probably more than double, not to let that make one a kind of an aesthete. Oh, isn't that all lovely? Or isn't that all terrible? Not to disengage. There is a way in which the complexity of things can become beautiful in its own right, or terrible in its own right, and then we disengage from caring. We disengage from trying to do something. So one of the edges that I try to walk on in this work is remaining committed to collective action. Okay? And collective action that isn't self-certain, that doesn't become the one true religion, of whatever doctrine is at hand. That knowing about the complexity and the doubleness of things cannot be allowed to result in cynicism or relativism of the form that, well, it's all just relative, so you don't need to take any positions. Nonsense. It's relational, not relativist in that cynical sense, if that's making any sense. I feel like I live in a relational world where making some relations stronger and others weaker is my job. And I'm entirely interested in making some relations weaker.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to hand it out to you all. And the last one is about responsibility and accountability. And you touched upon a little bit about how you can never unknow something. Would you mind just talking a little bit more about how can we be activated and responsible and accountable and live in this very difficult modern world where it is massive and everything is double, like you were just saying?
Well, I don't think the double in complexity is the same as massive. I think actually massive squashes complexity. And this takes me back to my affirming the ordinary. I think we live in these, the title of my last book was Staying with the Trouble. And I'm really serious about it. I think that we don't need to go to something that's supposedly large in order to cultivate responsibility, the capacity to respond. We cultivate the capacity to respond with each other here and now. And that here grows. Sometimes it shrinks. Sometimes that's a good thing. But we cultivate this capacity to do whirling with each other, to make worlds that we want to be, that we are committed to, here. We don't have this illusion that there's someplace else that we're supposed to be, that there's somewhere big and real and this place is small and not real. This place is complex and thick and contradictory and beautiful and horrible, and it's here. And that thinking that one should be somewhere else is completely disabling.
That's great. All right, so I'm going to let it all to you. Would you like one?
Yeah, you got a question. It's just very related to what you were just saying, because you were talking about being really focused in here and now, and would that stand because for certain people the here and now is disabling itself, which is why they seek to get somewhere else. So I was wondering what your take on that would be.
Well, the here and now can be extraordinarily violent and invalidating and deadly. But that doesn't mean one of the ways I try to think about that is you don't get somewhere else in the mode of escapism. You build someplace else to be with those who are your real allies and who will help make you safer, safe enough. Not safe in some kind of fantastic sense, but you build enough safety with people you trust and with animals you trust or with plants you trust. You learn, you and others with you become with more safely. And that might involve thickening a sense of that the here and now is not some kind of instantaneous now is not some kind of little mathematical point that kind of disappears as you move past in future. That now is thick. It endures. And working this now otherwise, so that the here and now becomes something safer and thicker and more sustaining than the here and now that is quite literally killing you.
So you seem to say something how it's important for us to try to be aware of issues around us and we should at least know about stuff. But with with our new technologies and all that, and how the world itself is becoming increasingly complex. I mean, just look at like now people, in order to get a job, you go to college and go through high school. But like back a few hundred years ago, you got the knowledge you needed in the world by just, going to school for like a year or so. And as we get increasingly advanced technologies and our world becomes increasingly complex, wouldn't the amount of stuff one person would have to be able to know to be truly aware of the world around them become overwhelming?
No. Though I know that you and I and others feel that way sometimes. And it's not it's a genuine dilemma. First, I think we misremember the past. And that the complexity of people's lives throughout the evolutionary history of our species has probably not actually been that different. And the process of learning the skills for getting and processing food, for building and sustaining social groups, for traveling through space and knowing, knowing something about the world in which you're moving and traveling, the skills for encountering and relating with strangers, so on and so on. I don't think it's ever been the case in the history of our species, or for that matter, in any other species, that there was a past in which things were simple. Okay. That said, our kind of complexity is different. Okay? And our kind of class structure and structure of the distribution of knowledge is different. And that while it was more or less true, I don't know if this is even true, what it takes actually to build a biological laboratory right now that is able to investigate, let's say, the heat tolerances of microbes that might be of use in thinking about dealing with questions of climate change. Okay. Think about what it actually takes to accumulate the people, the machinery, the organisms, the bodies of knowledge. And the first thing that crashes in on you is it's never just one person. And one person never knows the whole. And that one of the things that we gladly surrender, in thinking about becoming with as opposed to thinking about becoming, is that we never aim for being the one whole and complete knower. We learn how to work fruitfully in distributed systems. And that actually is not new. Calling them distributed systems is new. But that way of being in the world is pretty general in the biological world, including in the history of our species. So we have to know other things. And there are certainly whole groups of people in even in Santa Cruz, who don't have access, either because their families can't afford rent and they're homeless, or because their families don't have papers and they're afraid of deportation, or because their families can't afford the tuitions for a gateway or whatever, or because the public schools can't afford the kind of counseling services they need to really help kids, so on and so on. We can think about all the reasons that it's really hard to get a good education in Santa Cruz, in spite of which a lot of kids in Santa Cruz get really dynamite educations, in all kinds of ways. And I think of UCSC even. I know for a fact in my entire history on this campus since 1980s, almost no faculty that I know work to rule. Almost no faculty that I actually know do their job description. Almost all of them are doing way more than their job description. Almost all of the faculty I know are working flat out in an effort to try to be decent teachers. There are some that aren't like that, and there are some that are like that, but that has not been my general experience. And that's pretty much my experience of students, too. It's kind of common to hear people bad-mouthing students, et cetera, or they used to be better, or somehow they used to be more serious, or they used to be X. That was not my experience in more than 30 years of teaching large undergraduate classes on this campus. I found students as motivated, as smart, as passionate, as curious as ever, and doing everything they possibly could to become more alive, and it was kind of inspiring to be a teacher. And I don't think it's just this campus. So I'm really interested in foregrounding what I see people really doing, just often very inspiring. This is a recording thing, I think.
You spoke earlier about the connection between the search for transcendence, the denial of the body, the move to abstraction, and misogyny. Do you think that's exacerbated or changed by the digital and by the cybernetic, giving us more problems?
Well, I do think there are forms of sexual predation that work through social media that are new and that affect an awful lot of people. And that there are places for violence of many kinds, including sexual violence against children, against girls and women, against queers and trans people, that are mediated in the digital world, for sure. And that's worse in part because it's new, you know. So I think, yes, I can point to areas where I think things are worse. And then I look at the very complicated thing called the Me Too movement. Extremely, God almighty, with all of its warts and all of its extravagances and all the rest of it, that nonetheless has made it a whole lot harder to engage in sexual harassment in a whole lot of places. And thank the earth powers for the Me Too movement, no matter its complexities and, you know. So I think there's just a kind of energy that challenges domination and says, no, no more. And this is what it looks like, and this is what it feels like, and it is not okay, and we are not going away.
You seem to have a problem with the Me Too movement. Can you elaborate?
Well, I am its ally for sure. But I think, like any powerful movement, there can be a tendency to be, I think questions of evidence, being able to respond to charges, being able to have a transparent process, these are all really important. And I think that that is very difficult to sustain in periods of mass action. And I think most of the people I know who are committed to the Me Too movement do care a lot about due process and the ability to respond to charges, and most of all care about consequences, accountability, making things more safe as opposed to just going for violence that has already occurred. But they do care, and rightly so, about outing violence that has already occurred. And I also think, in principle, activists care about going slow enough that unintended violence doesn't occur. And I think the Me Too movement is as responsible as almost any other mass action movement for sometimes moving awfully fast without much chance for people to respond to charges. That worries me. Doesn't worry me as much as the violence against women and children, but it does worry me. I think it's important. You disagree, or not with a. You have different. It is. I see what you. No, I'm pretty much with you. And I think one of the things that we need to do in mass action movements is, and I do think Me Too UCSC does this. I think this is kind of call each other to account. Say, okay, look, we're not talking to the microphone right now. We're talking to each other. Let's figure this out. Let's figure out ways to forgive each other and go forward. Let's figure out ways to do this better. I think every mass action movement needs its own generous, spirited, self-critical mechanisms. And I think the Me Too movement is not bad at it, and needs to, but it's an ongoing process.
Donna, the couple of things you said really struck me very strongly. The idea that the smallest unit of analysis is a relationship, and in fact, we become only as we engage in that, and we do that in ordinary life. Am I correct in thinking that this is a really optimistic and hopeful view of the world?
Well, it does leave open the possibility that everything isn't going to hell in a handbasket. It's not particularly optimistic. I think I'm sort of resistant to both optimism and pessimism. It's more about ongoing. I'm committed to, this is really an ugly English word, I'm committed to ongoingness. I'm committed to going on with each other, to figuring out how to forgive and rebuild, as well as hold to account. Okay, and so I'm not particularly optimistic. For example, I think that loss is real and accelerating, and there will be no status quo ante. There will be no going back to a prior a state of partial equilibrium. The new equilibrium points will be different, and they will be worse in all kinds of describable ways. I'm talking biologically right now. So I think that extinction is real and accelerating. And anyone who thinks that there's a techno fix is in a state of abstract denialism, the kind I tried to describe. And living and dying, including in these kinds of large processual ways with each other, for slowing down the damage and opening up the spaces for rehabilitation and restitution. This is true in the Me Too movement, too. Opening up the spaces for rehabilitation and restitution that can't be done without acknowledging the damage. So I'm not an optimist, but I am committed to staying with the trouble.
I guess that's what I was suggesting is optimistic, because
Under the
as we
circumstances.
look as observers at going to hell in a handbasket as extinction proceeds,
It is really easy to despair.
it is, and I did not see you as despairing, and thank you.
You're right, I'm not. And sometimes that takes drugs. Drugs, sex, and rock and roll.
Okay.
That was not a pro-drug message.
That was a great line. So, one last question. Anyone? Okay.
So, what would you say would be the best takeaway for everyone in this room? Since I'm going to call us all youngsters. We're all youngsters going out into
Compared to my 3/4 of a century.
we're all youngsters, and we all have. It'd be fair to say that we have the power to change the world.
Yeah.
What would you say is the best advice so we can avoid extinction, and just make the world just a better place for everyone that's just going to come after us, like our
Yeah.
descendants and everything?
This kind of brings out my preacher self.
No, go ahead.
Well, but no,
Preach,
but
preach.
but actually, I have thought about this kind of a lot. This question, both for young people as well as folks at other points in their lives, and it goes back to this question also of here and now. They're related, in that I think that the takeaway for everybody in this room, each person is situated differently with different hopes and skills and fears, and people. There are a lot of similarities too, but people are positioned and situated very differently. I think that the take home is the commitment to live well now. To live now in the way that one wants to live later, insofar as it is possible. To be the kind of person now, which means making now better, that we hope is going to be possible in the future. That figuring out how to sustain each other now in a kind of real happiness, in a kind of, by which I mean a kind of affirmation of living and dying well with each other. So for me, that the take-home message is taking now seriously, and that might mean reading a book seriously and really closely, and reading it slowly enough to really take it in. It might mean responding to a friend's crisis. It might mean showing up for a climate march. It might mean being aware of the dilemma one's father is in and figuring out how to listen. It might mean a lot of things, but I think it means taking now seriously and living well, and building that with each other. There's no other place to go. In other words, I'm not particularly interested in avoiding extinction. I actually don't care about, in that sense, I don't care about extinction. I care about building the best possible nows, because I actually think that gives the best possible chance for healthy futures. But what I'm really committed to is a thick and robust, enduring, sustaining present. Wait, there's one more person who is eager, and we can do it.
Okay, being someone who's fascinated in mortality, I hope this is not too much of a sensitive question, But do you allow religion to play in your conclusions, especially since it's such an easy form to look back into the beginning of time and see how people think back then? You know what I mean?
Well, that's very. I grew up as a really serious, believing, caring Catholic. I was shaped in the social justice arm of the Catholic Church. It's really, really important to me. I left, but the formation, I understand two things. I understand how it's possible to be intellectually honest even when you're living in a totalitarian system. It's really hard work, but it can happen. You know? And I understand the way, something that, I understand the power of religion, okay? In its capacity to move, its capacity to make worlds. I also think that religion is an incredibly important part of contemporary history, not just in the United States, but really all sorts of places. I think that what gets called religion is a problem because the word itself is very modern. It's one of the terms that emerges in modernity and in opposition to science. So there's a hierarchy of magic, religion, science. There's supposedly this thing called religion, which is a vast misdescription of what people, of the practices and including the emotional, intellectual practices of people with each other that get called religion. I have a very soft spot in my heart for earth, love of the earth, and it's probably its most organized form is Wicca, is contemporary feminist witchcraft that involves both men and women significantly. I'm not a practitioner or an adherent, but I admit to a giant soft spot. It's impossible to answer that question except to say that I resist bottom lines. I resist a kind of religion is X and therefore my relation to it is Y. I think it's more complicated than that. Yeah.